chapter 40. And this topic that we're looking at tonight is going to take us, if I'm not mistaken, all the way to the end of the book. Yeah. So, there's still a few chapters left, but this is all going to be about the same thing, if you will, same topic, and it's another prophecy of things to come that the Lord is going to show to Ezekiel. And like some of the other prophecies that we've talked about with Ezekiel and with Daniel and with some others, almost everybody has their opinion. We're going to try to look at it from God's Word and see what God's Word has to say about it. I'll tell you, he starts off talking about this, talking about a city and a temple and those things. There's some out there that thinks that this is prophecy of the church, or some think it's even prophecy of the new city of Jerusalem to come. I don't believe that on this matter. One, as far as the new city of Jerusalem, the measurements are not the same that he gives, so it can't be. And we'll see it, because we're going to read this whole chapter. There's not a lot to really talk about, other than to explain a few things. So it's mostly going to be reading tonight. And I hope anyway that you'll see after we're done, you'll see what I'm talking about. That there's no way that this could be certain prophecies that certain people are preaching today, and some that have been preaching it for a long time. Some who are dead and gone now were preaching the same thing. And from what I've studied on this, I don't see that it could be that way, because for one, like I said, the measurements don't add up to the same as the new city of Jerusalem that we see in Revelation. And as far as the church is concerned, I don't believe that this fits that either. And generally, the ones who claim that this is talking about the church are universal church people, and they're the same ones who will say, well, this is the church, it's also the new city of Jerusalem, but that's not right. So let's start with verse 1, and we'll read. In the 25th year of our captivity, in the beginning of the year, in the 10th day of the month, in the 14th year after that the city was smitten, in the selfsame day, the hand of the Lord was upon me and brought me thither. So in the 25th year of their captivity, and 14 years after Jerusalem was destroyed, this is when this happens. As like fashion with almost everything that Ezekiel has written, he always gives us a time frame of when this takes place. So there's no doubt. We know that he's still in captivity. It's 25 years, notice, into the captivity, so there's still another, 45 years left of the captivity. Because remember, the captivity was 70 years. So they're not even close to not even halfway to the end of the captivity. In verse 2, in the visions of God brought he me into the land of Israel. Now notice here, this is a vision. He did not physically go to the nation of Israel. There's been other places that we've talked about in this book and in this study where God took him. Remember when God took him at one time, took him to Israel, to the temple, to Jerusalem, and showed him things there? Those were visions. He was not physically there. The same here. And he set me upon a very high mountain, by which was as the frame of a city on the south. So he sees the structure that looks similar to a city, something like a city. And And we're going to see more that he goes to describing the city here. But he here in this vision, the Lord sets him up on a high mountain. And remember, as we read through this is all a vision. He's not physically there, but it is a vision, and he's actually seeing these things, but it's through a vision. And it says, by which was as the frame of a city in the south. Now, I'll tell you my thought on that is I believe he's seeing Jerusalem, or what will be. Remember, at this time, Jerusalem's been destroyed, been burned to the ground. It's a pile of rocks. And I'm not going to go into much further on that, but just remember that Jerusalem will be rebuilt. And remember in Nehemiah's day, at the end of the captivity and shortly thereafter, they rebuilt the city of Jerusalem. They rebuilt the temple. And so, on the surface anyway, before we get too much far into this study, and before I haven't read that far ahead. I read a little bit ahead and studied a little bit ahead for next time, but not the rest of the book. But that's what it looks like to me, that this is the Lord showing Ezekiel that the city of Jerusalem and the temple are going to be rebuilt. And so, well, let's read on, and we'll see what else he has to say. And he brought me thither, and behold, there was a man whose appearance was like the appearance of brass, with a line of flax in his hand and a measuring rod, and he stood in the gate. Now, where have we seen a man that looks similar to this before? Was it not the Lord? In some of the visions that John had in Revelation, Daniel, I believe, and there's been other places in Ezekiel where we saw a man like the appearance of brass. It's very bright, very shine up and giving off a radiance. And he's got a line of flax in his hand. In other words, and a measuring. He's got measuring tools. And he stood in the gate. And the man said unto me, Son of man, behold with thine eyes, and hear with thine ears, and set thine heart upon all that I shall show thee. For to the intent that I might show them unto thee art thou brought hither, declare all that thou seest to the house of Israel. If this was concerning the new city of Jerusalem, why would it concern Israel at this point in time? That's another thing that doesn't make sense. Remember, the new city of Jerusalem is going to be where the bride and the bridegroom, once they're married, that's where they're going to live. Once the earth has been renovated. So, he says, declare all that thou seest to the house of Israel. Tell Israel what you see. Why? Well, because some of those people that are in captivity there with Ezekiel are going to be part of that group that go back after the captivity is over with. And behold, a wall on the outside of the house round about, and in the man's hand a measuring reed of 6 cubits long by the cubit, and 6 cubits long by the cubit, and a hand breadth. So he measured the breadth of the building, 1 reed, and the height 1 reed. So, if the footnotes in my Bible are correct, it's 10.5 feet by 10.5 feet. That's not a very big city. You notice he says a house here. So this is measuring possibly one room or a building of some sort, he says. This is not measuring the whole city, not yet. Then came he unto the gate which looketh toward the east, and went up the stairs thereof, and measured the threshold of the gate, which was 1 reed broad, and the other threshold of the gate, which was 1 one reed broad. So again, it's saying here that's another 10.5 feet. And every little chamber was 1 reed long and 1 reed broad, and between the little chambers were 5 cubits, and the threshold of the gate by the porch of the gate within was 1 reed. He measured also the porch of the gate within 1 reed. Then measured he the porch of the gate 8 cubits, and the post thereof 2 cubits, and the porch of the gate was inward, and the little chambers of the gate eastward were 3 on this side and 3 on that side. They 3 were of 1 measure, and the post had 1 measure on this side and on that side. Now, reading through this, the only other place in the Old Testament that I can think of that gives measurements, not the same measurements, but in a similar manner, was when God gave the measurements of the temple to Solomon. And that was one of the things that some of the commentaries mentioned, was that he was describing the temple here. But I want you to look at something before you get that in your mind. Go to chapter 41 and verse 1. Ezekiel 41 verse 1 says, afterward he brought me to the temple and measured the post. So after, and we'll see when we get through chapter 40, but after he tells him about what he tells him in chapter 40, then he takes him to the temple. So how can what he's doing in chapter 40 be the temple? I think my thought on this is, in chapter 40 he's describing the city, and then when we get to 41 he's going to describe the temple. Now, we may find out different as we read through this, but that's my first thought on this, okay? Now I forgot where I left off. What verse did I stop with? Verse 10? 9? Yeah, okay. In verse 10, and the little chambers of the gate eastward were 3 on this side and 3 on that side. They 3 were of 1 measure, and the post had 1 measure on this side and on that side. And he measured the breadth of the entry of the gate, 10 cubits, and the length of the gate, 13 cubits. The space also before the little chambers was 1 cubit on this side, and the space was 1 cubit on that side, and the little chambers were 6 cubits on this side, and 6 cubits on that side. He measured then the gate from the roof of one little chamber to the roof of another. And the breadth was 5 and 20 cubits, door against door. He made also posts of 80 cubits, even unto the post of the court round about the gate, and from the face of the gate of the entrance unto the face of the porch of the inner gate were 50 cubits. And there were narrow windows to the little chambers, and to their post within the gate round about, and likewise to the arches, and windows were round about inward, and upon each post were palm trees. Then brought he me into the outward court, and lo, there were chambers and a pavement made for the court round about. 30 chambers were upon the pavement, and the pavement by the side of the gates, over against the length of the gates, was the lower pavement. And he measured the breadth from the forefront of the lower gate unto the forefront of the inner court without, 100 cubits eastward and northward. And the gate of the outward court that looked toward the north, he measured the length thereof and the breadth thereof. And the little chambers thereof were 3 on this side and 3 on that side, and the posts thereof and the arches thereof were after the measure of the first gate. The length thereof was 50 cubits, and the breadth 5 and 20 cubits. And their windows, and their arches, and their palm trees were after the measure of the gate that looketh toward the east, and they went up unto it by 7 steps, and the arches thereof were before them. And the gate of the inner court was over against the gate toward the north and toward the east, and he measured from gate to gate 100 cubits. It's 175 foot. After that he brought me toward the south, and behold, a gate toward the south, and he measured the posts thereof and the arches thereof according to these measures. And there were windows in it, and in the arches thereof round about, like those windows, the length was 50 cubits, and the breadth 5 and 20 cubits. And there were 7 steps to go up to it, and the arches thereof were before them. And it had palm trees on one on this side and another on the other side upon the post thereof. And there was a gate in the inner court toward the south, and he measured from gate to gate toward the south 100 cubits. And he brought me to the inner court of the south gate, and he measured the south gate according to these measures, and the little chambers thereof, and the posts thereof, and the arches thereof, according to these measures. And there were windows in it, and in the arches thereof round about. It was 50 cubits long, and 5 and 20 cubits broad. And the arches round about were 5 and 20 cubits long, and 5 cubits broad. And the arches thereof were toward the utter court, and the palm trees were upon the posts thereof, and the going up to it, and they had 8 steps. And he brought me into the inner court toward the east, and he measured the gate according to these measures. And the little chambers thereof, and the posts thereof, and the arches thereof were according to these measures, and there were windows therein. And in the arches thereof round about, it was 50 cubits long, and 5 and 20 cubits broad. And the arches thereof were toward the outward court, and palm trees were upon the posts thereof on this side, on that side, and the going up to it had 8 steps. And he brought me to the north gate, and measured it according to these measures. The little chambers thereof, the posts thereof, and the arches thereof, and the windows to it round about. The length was 50 cubits, and the breadth 5 and 20 cubits. And the posts thereof were toward the utter court, and the palm trees were upon the posts thereof on this side and on that side, and the going up to it had 8 steps. And the chambers and the entries thereof were by the posts of the gates, where they washed the burnt offering. And in the porch of the gate were 2 tables on this side, and 2 tables on that side, to slay thereon the burnt offering, and the sin offering, and the trespass offering. And at the side without was one, as one goeth up to the entry of the north gate, were 2 tables, and on the other side, which was at the porch of the gate, were 2 tables. 4 tables were on this side, 4 tables on that side. By the side of the gate, 8 tables were upon, they slew their sacrifices. And the 4 tables were of hewn stone for the burnt offering, of a cubit and a half long, and a cubit and a half broad, and 1 cubit high. Whereupon also they laid the instruments wherewith they slew the burnt offering and the sacrifice. Within were hooks, and hand broad, about 3 inches is a hand broad, fastened about, and upon the tables was the flesh of the offering. And without the inner gate were the chambers of the singers in the inner court, which was at the side of the north gate, and their prospect was toward the south. One at the side of the east gate, having the prospect toward the north. And he said unto me, This chamber, whose prospect is toward the south, is for the priest, the keepers of the charge of the house. And the chamber whose prospect is toward the north is for the priest, the keepers of the charge of the altar. These are the sons of Zadok among the sons of Levi, which come near to the Lord to minister unto him. As he measured the court 100 cubits long and 100 cubits broad, foursquare, and the altar that was before the house. Now, before we read the last two verses, the more we read into this, the more it sounds like the temple. We're going to read more into it in the next two verses, and then next time also in the next chapter. In the beginning I said that, possibly this was the city, but if you read more into this, as you read along, you see that it sounds more like the temple. But we also know that in the next chapter, he says the very first thing afterward, he brought me to the temple. So we'll see what he's talking about as we go along. Verse 48, and he brought me to the porch of the house, and measured each post of the porch, five cubits on this side, and 5 cubits on that side, and the breadth of the gate was 3 cubits on this side, and 3 cubits on that side. The length of the porch was 20 cubits, and the breadth 11 cubits. And he brought me by the steps whereby they went up to it, and there were pillars by the post, one on this side and one on that side. So by the time you get to, when we start off in chapter 40, he talks about a frame of a city, seeing a frame of a city. And then the more we read, the more this sounds like a temple, doesn't it? We know that the temple was within the walls of the city of Jerusalem. Is it that the frame of the city that he saw, or what he saw was like the frame of the city? Was that what was left of Jerusalem, and it was about to be rebuilt, possibly? All these things, he talks about all these inner and outer courts and all these gates and all this stuff. But if you remember, in Solomon's day, when all the measurements were given, it tells about how all the altars and all the furnishings for the temple were described. What we're seeing here is nothing as immaculate as who the first temple was. And if you study the history of the second temple, and we'll see later, and then towards the end of the book, and then if my plan has been all along to go into Nehemiah next with this study, we'll see more of Nehemiah, how what Ezekiel is talking about in the last chapters of the book of Ezekiel, what he has written here, the vision that the Lord has given him. We'll see some of this in Nehemiah, because that's when the temple was rebuilt, the temple and the city. So my encouragement to you is, before we form any opinion on what he's describing here, let's keep reading, and we'll see it, because we have to read it all in its context. We get to read a few chapters. Now, let's go ahead and we're going to read a few verses into chapter 41 and stop, and then we'll come back, and next time we'll start over with the first of 41. But in verse 1 in chapter 41, he says, afterward he brought me to the temple and measured the post, 6 cubits broad on the one side, 6 cubits broad on the other side, which was the breadth of the tabernacle. So, and then he says, then the breadth of the door was 10 cubits, and the sides of the door were 5 cubits on the one side and 5 cubits on the other side. He measured the length thereof 40 cubits, and the breadth 20 cubits. Then when he entered and measured the post of the door, 2 cubits, the door 6 cubits, and the breadth of the door 7 cubits. Well, instead of reading all these measurements, just stop right there. And back in verse 1, he says, which was the breadth of the tabernacle. It's my understanding that when we think of the tabernacle as being what they had, basically the tent they had, the pre-temple place to worship that they had in the wilderness, and then what they had up until Solomon's day was their place to worship before the temple. But this is not the same tabernacle. What I believe he's talking about here, and I think what he's going to go on to describe in chapter 41 is the part of the temple that held the Holy of Holies. So it's the more inner part of the temple, and he mentions the tabernacle here, and I think that's why he mentions the tabernacle here, because it's thought of, at least in the context here in this chapter. I believe we'll see that it's going to be the innermost part of the Holy of Holies. If you go down to verse 18, he says, and it was made with cherubims. Oh, back at verse 17. To that above the door, even unto the inner house and without, and by all the wall round about, within and without, by measure. And it was made with cherubims and palm trees, so that a palm tree was between a cherub, and every cherub had two faces, so that the face of a man was toward the palm tree on the other side, and the face of a young lion toward the palm tree on the other side. It was made through all the house round about. From what I remember of the temple in Solomon's day, when they talk about the cherubims, they were in, or their images were in the inner part of the temple, not just, on the, we see, I guess we think of these Catholic churches all over Europe that have different images on the corners, gargoyles and whatever else hideous things they put on their buildings or they have for hundreds of years. That's not what the cherubims were. They were in the innermost part of the temple. So we'll stop there for tonight. I know you may be totally confused about what I talked about tonight, but it'll clear up as we go along in the next couple of chapters. So we'll stop there for now.